They were just three old women. That's what everyone said. They lived quietly on the edge of Chicago, tucked away in a weather-beaten house where the curtains were always drawn and the porch light flickered like it was tired of staying on. Neighbors waved. Shopkeepers carried their groceries. Strangers dismissed them as harmless. Frail hands, soft voices, slow steps. But Appalachia had been whispering their names for decades. Men went missing along back roads and train stops. Drifters vanished after accepting warm meals. Lonely souls were last seen walking toward that house, drawn in by smiles that felt too kind and hospitality that lingered too long. Police chalked it up to runaways. Families blamed the city. No one thought to look at three elderly women who baked bread on Sundays and fed stray cats. That was the mistake, because behind those gentle faces lived something old, something patient, something that didn't rush. They weren't motivated by money. They didn't seek revenge. According to the rumors that crept through Appalachian towns and Chicago alleyways alike, they did it for entertainment, for the thrill of control, for the power of deciding who walked away and who didn't. No witnesses ever testified. No solid evidence ever surfaced. Just patterns, just disappearances, just a growing fear that some monsters don't hide in shadows. They hide in plain sight, wearing cardigans and offering tea. This is the Appalachian story of the three old women Chicago never suspected, and the men who learned too late that evil doesn't always look dangerous. The hollers of eastern Kentucky hold secrets the way limestone holds water, deep and cold and persistent. This is a story folks still whisper about when the mist settles thick in the valleys, though most who tell it get the details wrong. They say it happened in Chicago, but that's only half true. The roots of this tale run deep in Appalachian soil, in a place where Caney Creek winds through mountains old as sin itself. The three women came from Chicago in the summer of 1947, dressed in black despite the heat, driving a powder blue Packard that seemed too fine for the rutted roads of Harlan County. They arrived at the old Jessup place, a farmhouse that had stood empty since the mine collapse of '32 took most of the menfolk from these parts. Locals called them the Widow Sisters, though nobody knew if they were actually kin. There was Vera, tall and thin as a birch sapling, with silver hair she wore in a tight bun. Margaret, round and soft-spoken, with hands that were always busy with knitting needles or pie dough. And Dolores, the youngest at perhaps 60, with dark eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. They kept to themselves mostly, tending a garden that flourished impossibly well and attending Sunday services at the Baptist church, where they sang hymns in voices sweet as honey. They brought preserves to shut-ins and helped birth babies when the midwife was too drunk or too far. Within a year, folks had mostly forgotten they were outsiders. But then the strangers started coming. First was a man named Curtis Webb, a Bible salesman from Lexington who knocked on doors throughout the county. He stopped at the Widow Sisters' place on a Tuesday afternoon in August. His car was found 3 days later, parked neat as you please behind the old barn. But Curtis himself was never seen again. The sheriff, a lazy man named Boggs, who spent more time fishing than investigating, figured Curtis had just wandered off, maybe fell down a mine shaft. The mountains were full of them, abandoned and dangerous. 2 months later came Albert Pritchard, a surveyor working for a coal company out of Virginia. He'd been asking questions around town about mineral rights and old land deeds. Last anyone saw him, he was heading up the hollow toward the widow sister's place, his leather satchel full of maps and documents tucked under his arm. His body was found 6 weeks later by a hunter at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles from the Jessup farmhouse. Doc Henderson ruled it an accidental fall, though some folks noticed Albert's boots were on the wrong feet and his pockets had been turned inside out. The pattern continued. A drifter here, a traveling salesman there, always men, always alone, always last seen somewhere near Caney Creek. The bodies that turned up showed signs of falls, drowning, heart attacks. Natural causes in an unnatural abundance. It was young Tommy Bledsoe who first spoke the suspicion aloud. Tommy worked at the post office and had a mind sharper than most gave him credit for. He'd been keeping track, marking names and dates in a little notebook he kept hidden in his desk drawer. 17 men in 4 years, he told his sweetheart, Mary Catherine, one evening on her porch. And every single one of them went up to that farmhouse before they disappeared or turned up dead. Tommy Bledsoe, you hush that kind of talk, Mary Catherine scolded, though her voice wavered. Those are respectable Christian women. They bring me Mama Peach preserves every summer. Respectable Christian women from Chicago? Tommy said. You ever wonder why they left the city? Why 3 wealthy widows would come to a played-out mining town in the middle of nowhere? Mary Catherine didn't have an answer for that. The truth, as Tommy would eventually discover, was stranger and darker than anyone in Harlan County could have imagined. The widow sisters had indeed come from Chicago, from a brick townhouse on the south side, where they'd lived for nearly 20 years. They'd been neighbors first, then friends, drawn together by the common thread of cruel husbands and limited options. Vera's husband had broken her arm twice and her jaw once. Margaret's had gambled away everything, including her grandmother's silver and the deed to her family home. Dolores's husband had kept a mistress in an apartment he paid for with Dolores's inheritance. They'd borne it all in silence, as women of their generation were expected to do, until the winter of 1928, when Vera's husband came home drunk and violent for the last time. Vera had been stirring soup on the stove. The iron pot was heavy and the soup was boiling. The coroner ruled it an accidental death. Tragic how the man had slipped on the icy kitchen floor and struck his head. The 3 women had gathered at the funeral, holding hands in the back pew. They didn't speak of what they knew, but understanding passed between them like electricity through wire. Margaret's husband died 6 months later, falling down the stairs in their home. Dolores's husband succumbed to what appeared to be a heart attack in his sleep, though the mistress reported he'd been in perfect health just hours before. For nearly 2 decades, the 3 widows had lived quietly in Chicago, managing their inherited money carefully, attending the opera, taking tea together every Thursday afternoon. But they'd developed a taste for something else too, a particular kind of justice that the law couldn't or wouldn't provide. They were careful, always. They chose men who were traveling through, men with no local connections, men who, upon closer observation, revealed themselves to be cruel or predatory or corrupt. A loan shark who bragged about bankrupting families. A merchant who cheated his customers with weighted scales. A politician who'd taken bribes to look the other way, while tenement buildings burned. Chicago became too risky after the 17th body, a bootlegger's enforcer who disappeared after visiting Margaret's townhouse. Questions were being asked. A detective had knocked on Vera's door twice in 1 week, so they'd packed their belongings, sold their properties, and headed south, to a place where life was cheap and death came easy, where the law was lazy and strangers were common. But Tommy Bledsoe's suspicions, once spoken aloud, began to spread. Sheriff Boggs might have been lazy, but he wasn't stupid, and even he couldn't ignore the whispers that filled the courthouse steps and the church parking lot. He drove out to the Jessup place on a gray November morning, his deputy nervous in the seat beside him. The 3 women received him on the wide front porch, offering coffee and apple cake fresh from the oven. They answered his questions with patient smiles. No, they hadn't seen the missing surveyor. Yes, they'd spoken to the Bible salesman, but he'd left after they'd declined to purchase anything. They were just 3 old women living quietly, bothering no one. Sheriff Boggs left with a slice of cake wrapped in wax paper and a vague sense that he'd been handled, though he couldn't quite say how. That night, the 3 widows sat around their kitchen table, the oil lamp casting long shadows on the walls. They'd known this moment would come eventually. It always did. "We could leave again," Margaret said quietly, her knitting needles clicking in the silence. "Head west maybe, Montana or Oregon." "Running gets tiresome," Vera replied, gazing out the window at the dark mountains. "And we're not as young as we were." Dolores said nothing, just traced patterns on the worn tablecloth with one finger. They made their decision without words, the way they often did. They would stay, they would be more careful, and they would accept that all things, even their particular mission, must eventually end. Tommy Bledsoe disappeared 3 weeks later. His notebook was never found. Sheriff Boggs investigated with more diligence this time, but the trail went cold at the edge of Caney Creek, where Tommy's hat was discovered snagged on a branch, half submerged in the swift current. Mary Catherine grieved properly, wearing black for a full year. The widow sisters attended the funeral, singing "In the Sweet By and By" in their perfect 3-part harmony. They brought Mary Catherine a sympathy casserole and stayed to help clean up after the service. Years passed. The widows grew older, their hair whiter, their steps slower. They became fixtures of the community, those sweet old ladies who made the best preserves and never missed a church service. New families moved in. Old suspicions faded into legend, then into ghost stories parents told to keep children from wandering too far into the hollers. Vera died first in the winter of 1959, peacefully in her sleep. Margaret and Dolores buried her in the little cemetery behind the Baptist church, under a simple stone that read, "Beloved Sister." Margaret followed 3 years later, her heart simply giving out one Sunday morning before church. Dolores lived alone in the farmhouse for another decade, a brittle old woman with dark eyes that had lost none of their sharpness. She died in 1972 at the age of 85 and was buried beside her sisters. The Jessup place stood empty again. Eventually it was torn down, the land sold off to a developer from Lexington who built a convenience store and a gas station where the house had been. But on certain nights, when the mist settles thick in the valleys and the moon hangs low over the mountains, folks say You can still hear singing coming from up Caney Creek way. 3 voices in perfect harmony, sweet as honey, cold as justice, singing hymns for the dead. Tommy Bledsoe's notebook did eventually surface, found in 1985 by a construction worker tearing out walls in the old post office. It contained names and dates, careful observations, and a final entry dated the day before Tommy disappeared. Going to confront them tomorrow. If I don't come back, someone should know the truth. But by then, there was no one left to confront, no justice left to serve. The 3 old women had returned to the earth, taking their secrets with them into the cold Kentucky clay. The truth is this: some stories don't have morals, some mysteries don't have solutions, and sometimes justice wears a respectable dress and bakes excellent pies and sings hymns in a voice sweet enough to make angels weep. The mountains of Appalachia remember, the hollers hold their secrets, and on quiet nights in Harlan County, when the wind moves through the trees just right, you might still hear those 3 voices singing the old hymns, keeping time with the slow tick of eternity and the swift rush of Caney Creek running over stones